welcome to session 3 of Global Town Hall. What we have right now are three excellent speakers who will help us discuss the topic populism and nationalism during the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'd like to do now is to introduce first our three speakers and then start our discussion. So our first speaker is Professor Stephen Smith. He served as the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia from 2007 to 2010 and Minister for Defense of Australia from 2010 to 2013. He's now serving as a board member of Perth US Asia Center and Professor of International Law at the University of Western Australia. Good afternoon, sir. Professor Smith, good afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Banloy. Good afternoon to you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Professor Davi Fortuna Anwar. I have known her for a long time in various academic activities in Southeast Asia. He served as member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament from 2008 to 2012, Deputy for Government Policy Support to the Vice President of Indonesia from 2015 to 2017, a research professor at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences and co-founder of this organizer, Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. Good afternoon, Professor Davi.
Hello.
And last but not the least, from the United States in Washington, D.C., Ms. Amisha Cross. He was the National Director of Diversity and Outreach at Young Democrats of America from 2013 to present, communication analyst on Barack Obama's campaign, 2008 to 2012, director of state policy at Petrial Justice Institute, which in fact 2018 until present, and currently the political commentator at Sinclair Broadcast Group. Good afternoon, Misha.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, very good. Now, I would like to ask the first question. So I would like to remind all members of the panel that you have 5 minutes to answer this question. So I would like to throw this question first to Professor Smith. So what do you think is the state of populism today, and how are populist leaders faring in the time of COVID-19 pandemic? Go ahead, Professor Smith.
Well, I think the risk and the danger of populism is always at a point when a country or a region or the globe faces a time of crisis. Now, historically, they've either been security crises or economic crises. And often when there's economic hard times or an economic crisis in a country, it's very easy for simplistic populist notions to be presented as a solution to a nation's economic issues or problems. This year, of course, the end of last year and this year, we've seen a crisis of a different nature, which of course is a global pandemic. And that also presents the ingredients for populism to flourish, because you have a crisis, nations are in the throes of trying to deal with that crisis, citizens become concerned, and it's very easy in that environment, just as it is in an economic and a security environment, for simplistic notions to be presented as a quick and an easy solution to a pandemic or a health crisis. Now, there is, of course, an ultimate solution to a pandemic crisis, which is to find an appropriate vaccine which will immunize people to the adverse consequences, but that always takes time. So in the first stages of a economic, security or pandemic crisis, it's easy for populism to flourish. And so if you looked at our current environment, perhaps the two most noteworthy populists in the context of a pandemic have been Trump and Bolsonaro. So there are others who potentially qualify, but they're the two who have gathered the most publicity and certainly sit, in the case of Trump, in one of the globe's most important positions, and in the case of Bolsonaro, a deeply significant country as well. And in the first instance, simplistic notions and simplistic solution works. But as the crisis gets deeper and the need to depend upon evidence-based solutions, on science, on the advice carefully considered of experts, the longer the crisis goes, the more the simple, easy, populist solution is exposed as not being adequate. And I think easy to start off as a populist in a crisis, But if you want to successfully resolve a pandemic or a health crisis, you have to be cognizant of the evidence, cognizant of the scientific solutions, and methodically work your way through that, while at the same time explaining to your citizens that these are complex and complicated matters, and people shouldn't be afraid or be fearful. They should just understand by the information which the government of the day and officials of the day are transmitting and the scientists of the day are transmitting, that there are ways in which you can protect yourself and ways in which a country or a citizenry can work its way through those problems. So the longer a crisis goes, the more a populace will be exposed as having empty solutions which don't actually work. So a solution which is make America great again is not an appropriate policy response to a pandemic crisis. And so that's how I currently read our circumstances. The longer a crisis goes, the more difficult it is for a populist to not be exposed for not having the solutions which are required in an assiduous manner.
So do you think, Professor Smith, that populist leaders are doing well during this time of crisis, or they're just the same with other leaders around?
Well, you could cogently argue on the evidence that the populist approach to the pandemic, to the COVID pandemic, the populists at the end of the day are doing worse. So when you look at the countries who have coped, who have been assiduous, who've tried to adopt a scientific or a forensic approach, whether that's Korea, whether that's Taiwan, whether that's indeed Australia, those countries are doing better in difficult circumstances. And in Europe and the United Kingdom, whilst, for example, from time to time, Boris Johnson might feel compelled to go for a popular or an easy solution, invariably countries are driven back to a more methodical scientific approach. And the UK and Sweden are perhaps good examples of that. So I think whilst we've gone through a very difficult period, in a sense, one of the good things which has come out of this crisis is it's shown to countries, to citizens, to regions and to the world that when faced with a crisis, evidence-based responses, careful, methodical work is in the long term a much better approach than a simplistic solution, which is often, if not always, bound to fail.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Smith. How about you, Professor Davi? Do you have something to add? What's your take about the question on the state of populism today, and how are populist leaders faring in the time of this crisis?
Well, I'm very glad that Stephen went before me, because he has already outlined the basics of populism. You know, it's more very emotional in nature. You know, it tends to be anti-establishment. And before COVID, in fact, you know, the populism was on the rise as a backlash against unfettered globalization. So there's anti-globalization, anti-materialism, anti-free trade, anti-elites, basically, you know, and we saw that was very much on the rise before COVID. And I agree that COVID in the initial days has made populism stronger in a way, because the very rapid spread of COVID-19 was regarded as, you know, proof of this unfettered globalization, that, you know, a virus that started in a small town in China can spread over the world within a very short time. So the immediate solution was, of course, you know, to lock your borders. And you know, the populism tends to be very nativistic in its nature, tends to be inward-looking, anti-others. You know, in Europe and America, it's anti-immigration. And COVID, to a certain extent, because we need to disrupt the spread, you know, led to countries to lock their borders, and disruptions of international trade, tourism, and investment. So during the beginning, as Professor Stephen Smith said, you know, it actually strengthened the arguments of these populist leaders. But there's a downside. There's this populism, this simplistic notion that just through spirit or prayers that you can overcome COVID, you know, and anti-scientism, anti-evidence based, it's much more intuitive, much more emotional rather than rationality. It worked in the beginning to rally your support base, but as it goes on, it's clear that one cannot solve the problems. And in order to develop vaccines, countries are forced to cooperate. Getting out of the WHO is not a solution, during a global pandemic. So no single country can really overcome the triple impacts of COVID-19. Firstly, the public health impact. Secondly, the economic impact, recession, and thirdly, the social welfare impact, and so on. And countries need to work together on this, and leaders need to listen to scientists. And it is true that if your question, which countries are best in addressing the COVID, well, democratic countries and authoritarian countries, some are doing well and some are not doing so well. So it's not in terms of the institutions itself, but really the disciplines and the willingness to listen to experts on this, and the rigorousness in the consistency of the policy. So it's probably less populism or not populism, but it's how governance is more effective or not. But on the whole, I would argue that populist leaders have tended to do less well. And in fact, they got infected by COVID. Boris Johnson, the Brazilian president, and President Trump also got infected by COVID. Thank God that, they have recovered. So to reiterate, simple solution is emotionalism, work well during the early days of the crisis. But as the crisis goes on, I would argue that it is not possible to solve your problems through simplistic strategies, or just through your nativistic, your inward-looking strategy. One needs regional cooperation. One needs international multilateral cooperation, and all, it needs a whole nation and whole global situation, because no country is safe until all countries are safe. And you can't say that the elites are less vulnerable or the poor are less vulnerable, because COVID does not respect social status or borders. So in this case, it's actually the populist leaders are really challenged, and what happened in the United States, I think, is probably proof of that. If there is no COVID, maybe Trump could still win the election, but his failure to deal with COVID is one of the issues that led to his defeat.
Thank you, Professor Davi. You raised a lot of issues, but I have a follow-up question. Do you agree with the observation that populist leaders at present are listening more to the popular sentiments rather than to experts and scientists? Very quick reaction, Professor Davi.
Well, popular leaders by nature say that they are pro-people, and they say that they see experts as being elitist. So in that way, it may work on certain issues, but not on issues like climate change or pandemic, which is clearly, it has to be based on evidence.
Thank you very much. How about you, Amisha? What do you think? What's the state of populism today, and how are populist leaders faring in the time of this crisis?
Well, from the aspect of being an American and seeing what has happened here over the past few years, and mind you, populism was on the rise in the United States long before President Trump. It's something that I've studied and written about for now over a decade. What we've seen is that anytime you have an immigrant population that increases, anytime you have an elite population that feels as though equity is going to be something that demonstratively sets a standard that they do not like, or you see a class of people who now feel like they have to compete. They want to find an enemy. They want to find something that they can look at and say, that's someone who I want to keep back. I would argue that American populism has existed for generations across this country. And what we have seen over the past few years is it only expand, because under Trump, we saw a president who looked to other nations and dictatorships specifically, and not only praised dictators, but also patterned himself after them. And I think that when we think of populism in that context, when we think of the cult of personality it takes to make populism work, you also have to have a fundamental understanding of what people actually, of a people who feel like they have been downtrodden, even if they really haven't. In America, the downtrodden populations always tend to be minority populations, Black, brown, immigrants. But these aren't the people who latch on to populism. The people who latch on to populism are often those who are in the upper echelon. They're people who are middle-class whites. They're people who feel as though, again, they don't want to compete. They feel as though they're immigrants who should not be here. So I feel, the sentiment there is one that is of grief, one that is upset, one that does not want to feel like the America that they know and love is slipping away from them. And they found someone in Trump who was willing to take it to its limits and showcase to them just how much he was going to do to make America great again, i.e. take it back to a time where these people were greatly disenfranchised. And what we've seen here is that populism, even though President Trump obviously recently lost his election, whether he wants to admit it or not, populism didn't die. Actually, I think populism got a lot stronger. Though President Trump lost his race, Republicans won down ballot races at astronomical levels, not only in Congress and in the House as well as the Senate, but also we're seeing it at the state level as well. Many state legislative wins that Democrats had in the last session are now gone. And I think that proves a point that populism has taken hold in this country, specifically the conversations around the working class and making the working class feel as though those minorities are the ones who are making things harder for them. That is a message that has been latched onto very strongly. And I don't think that that's going to go away anytime soon. And when we relate it to the response to COVID-19, the recognition has to be that populism and individualism go hand in hand. Populism and not being a global nation, or not seeing the necessity to have those conversations and to honor treaties and to honor long-standing principles of relationships with our partner nations is something that is fundamental to what populism is, because there's an idea that you can go it alone. And what we know is that that's not possible. We knew it wasn't possible before COVID-19. But with the advent and the spread of this virus, what we're seeing is a nation under President Trump, and a nation that even after President Trump will still be grappling with the effects of populism, because quite frankly, a large majority of the American population has latched onto it, wanted to find someone to blame for not being able to make as much as they would like, for not being able to for not being able to have or live in the homes that they wanted to. I think that a lot of the economic downturn of 2008 and then what we're seeing now has actually advanced that populism narrative to a certain extent. And to Professor Smith's point, one of the hugest drivers of populism across, I think, all countries is a shift in the economy. When people feel as though they are not where they used to be or where they want to be, they all of a sudden develop these weird scenarios around how and who is to blame for that. And I think that these populist characters who carry the mantle, who come out, they find an enemy, they find an outgroup, and they are able to posit a lot of their narrative around that group. And they easily are able to create that group or make that group into an enemy. And to the credit of the Republican Party, sadly, and the Trump administration and his campaign, their use of vitriol and their use of that narrative, specifically anti-immigrant, specifically anti-Black Lives Matter and anti-Black, was used across social media channels, and they use social media as a weapon. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of these populist leaders do. They recognize that the propaganda in terms of turning people's interests away from and diminishing the authority of science, but also the authority and the understanding and the belief in systems is very important. And they utilize these social media channels to say that these systems no longer matter, or these systems are faulty. President Trump is now doing it with the voting system in general, but we also saw him do it with the justice system. We saw him do it with several others, healthcare, education. He's been able to disrupt with the press. We've seen him disrupt so many systems and make people think that these things are inherently wrong. These things are inherently against you. What they're telling you is wrong. And when you see so many people latch onto that in a very devastating way, that is a very difficult thing to shutter. So I know that for those who are not necessarily here in the United States, this can be, there's a lot of triumph and excitement over President Trump leaving office. But I would posit and say that just because President Trump didn't win his reelection doesn't mean that populism is gone or populism is dead in this country. It's something that we're going to be dealing with for many years to come. And it's something that President-elect Joe Biden will also deal with in his administration, being mindful that the Congress that he is walking in with is one that bought into that populism narrative, and one that is not willing to let it go anytime too soon.
Thank you, Misha. In fact, what you have just said is a segue to the second question, and I would like to ask you for the second questions. So, what kind of nationalism has emerged during the pandemic, and how does it influence national policies aimed at responding to the public health and economic crisis?
Well, President Trump had a nationalism narrative that was created long before the pandemic. It was America first. And America first, he's been carrying that mantle. He held it when he ran for office in 2016, and he's held it all the way through this pandemic, and I think he will beyond it. And America first, that mantra, because Americans happen to be very individualistic in nature in general, it happened to be something that I think a lot of people latched onto, even people who aren't Republicans. America first, in his mind, though, meant that we can go it alone. Meant that the United States is the be all to end all. We are the guiding light. We don't need any assistance. We are going to break relationships with longstanding partners and allies that we've had for generations. We don't need these treaties. We don't need the Paris Accords. All of these things don't matter because we can create our own policy and guide the rest of the world. If they don't follow us, then we'll just steamroll them, basically. That doesn't work. And it doesn't work because those alliances matter. America is, a young country. With as much as Americans love we love our flag and we love our anthems and all of those things. America is one of the youngest countries in the globe. And there's a recognition that a lot of our success is based on the strength of the economies of other nations as well. And that we cannot continue as an isolated nation. One, because it causes severe problems, not only in terms of our military and what's going to happen there, but also being cognizant of the fact that there are so many nations' economies that we too depend on to survive. And I think that there's an idea now that, especially with COVID-19, and we saw this with the race to find a vaccine, to make a vaccine, that originally President Trump was advocating to have these pharmaceutical companies make vaccines only available to America, which was completely ridiculous because you don't want to be the only nation on the globe that has healthy people when there's a pandemic that is affecting everyone. But it was a frustrating thing to watch. And I don't think that we would have ever had any president to, vocally make those types of statements before President Trump. But in the era of populism, you saw people who stood by and thought that was a good thing. And I personally was greatly disturbed by that because that's not how healthcare, that's not how the common good works. But I think that what we have seen with this president is someone who has been able to utilize the media, who has been able to utilize social media, who's been able to utilize messaging in a way that elevates America, meanwhile diminishing every other nation around us. And it's frustrating because it puts us at a very strong loss, particularly because we know that there's so much that goes into the process of not only developing drugs, but also developing a coherent strategy around a pandemic that has affected everyone from shore to shore. And right now, we've also seen that populism has also not only segmented us from other nations, it's also segmented us as Americans from other people in our own country. We've seen this because President Trump has decided to dig his heels in and not work with Democrats across the aisle. He's also decided that he's not going to work with the majority of states in this country. And it's frustrating to watch because it's slowed down our response. We could have responded differently. We could have not basically led the globe when it came to discrimination. President Trump didn't shut down the borders to China because he cared about COVID-19. He shut down the borders to China for the same reason that he wanted to employ so many restrictions on trade in China, because he wants to punish China. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. And I think that, there's a greater thing there that we have to dig into because that's a problem. In addition to that, he was very serious about ignoring the fact that COVID-19 was an issue, saying that, we were safe from it and that our borders were not going to be affected. He said that for months while COVID-19 was spreading throughout the United States. He told everyone that we were going to be fine, that it was going to be gone by Easter. Obviously, that didn't happen. He told everyone that when weather was coming, that it would be gone then. That didn't happen. And now he's quite frankly just ignoring it completely and not saying anything, meanwhile trying to still pretend as though the election didn't happen a few weeks ago. So I think that we get frustrated for the most part and lulled away by a lot of his antics, but there is a tangent of the system, a tangent of populism that continues to bubble up and continues to rise. And it has very detrimental effects. Where we had a hot spot here or there a few months ago when it came to COVID-19, today, as of this month, every single state in America is a hot spot. We're telling people that they can't travel for, the holidays, they can't see their families. You have more and more people who are going to be out of work. We have more and more people who are going to not have unemployment benefits extended. This is a huge problem. And if we had have responded differently, if we had have responded early, if we hadn't have been, xenophobic in our approach, I think that we would have been in a much different place.
Thank you. In fact, we're already getting a lot of questions from the public, but let me finish first our first part. So I would like to ask Professor Davi, do you have something to add about this question about what kind of nationalism has emerged during this pandemic?
Well, Dr. Rommel, I think countries in Southeast Asia, which has come up from colonialism and where the national unity and state cohesiveness is still in the process of making, we have a rather different take on nationalism. Nationalism is not really seen as something a negative, as being anti-foreign, but mostly nationalism is a force that binds the countries. Like in Indonesia, the force of nationalism is the one that enables over 700 different ethnic groups to come together, different religions to come together. So for us, nationalism is considered to be, on general, a positive nationalism. And the COVID-19 has shown that national resilience is very important. So here, I would like to argue not nationalism in terms of xenophobia or anti-foreigners or anti-external engagements, but the stress is more on how a nation state can cope in the times of like global pandemic, where your supplies of necessary goods are disrupted, particularly in big countries, where different regions have to basically survive on their own in providing food security, energy security, also medical supplies. So in this case, there is an argument not to become overly dependent on imports, how to develop greater national capacity to fulfill your basic needs, at least for a certain period of time when you do not have that supply. So this has worked in a way to strengthen the more protectionist elements in the country. A country like Indonesia has always been rather ambivalent. On the one hand, it engages in various regional and multilateral economic engagements. We're part of the ASEAN community, and now we are part of RCP. We are, very committed to multilateral engagements. We are part of APEC. But at the same time, there's always this fear that Indonesians are not as competitive. So you can see that there is, on the one hand, there is this desire to strengthen internal capacity, and that's nationalism. Talking about import substitutions again, which is fashionable in the 70s, and then it went away for a while, but then now it's becoming fashionable again, that, we need to be able to supply our basic needs. So this is getting very, very popular. So it's not entirely negative in that respect. And as I said, but for countries in Southeast Asia, our nationalism has always been closely linked also to regional cooperation. So it's not just national resilience, but also regional resilience, because no ASEAN countries can survive on its own either. We are only part of an ASEAN community. So our nationalism is always anchored within close regional cooperation. But at the end of the day, when you have a crisis, when you cannot get supplies from outside, there should be enough buffer stocks within each country. There should be sufficient capacity to provide healthcare, to provide food, provide energy, to provide clothing to your own people. But at the same time, during this pandemic crisis, the one that survives is e-commerce, and that can transcend national boundaries. and also e-learning, which, and also these kinds of virtual meetings and activities. So you have at the physical level, nation states sometimes have to become much more self-sufficient, but at the same time, they should be also be able to take advantage of what the technology has to offer that can transcend national boundaries. So I do not see this virulent xenophobia too much in our part of the world. There are others, but I think because countries in Southeast Asia have been so integrated into this ASEAN regional mechanisms where we engage not just with the countries in South Asia, but also with our dialogue partners, and in terms of economic development, we are so dependent on foreign direct investments, and our markets are always, we have China as the largest market, and the United States the single largest market, and the European Union, that kind of very inward-looking nationalism is not really the mainstream.
Yeah, coming from the Philippines, I cannot agree more with Professor Davi, but how about Professor Smith from down under? What do you think of it? Yeah.
Well, there's a lot in what Amisha and Ibu Dwi have said that I strongly agree with. So firstly, Amisha's point, which is it's more often than not the case that populism flourishes at a time when there is economic difficulty. And you see the link with COVID-19, the pandemic, with economic difficulty, and the arguments that if we take the necessary steps to reduce the risk of COVID-19, then we have to close up our economy, and we can't afford to do that. So there's the historic and the ongoing basis for populism is a simplistic solution held out to those people who are in economic difficulty. And in the case of the United States, I agree with the analysis which says that Donald Trump got himself to office not just because he got what I've seen described as sort of a group or a pile of deplorables to support him, but because he was able to suggest to those people, particularly in rural and regional America, that their economic chance of the American dream had gone, and they were best off getting behind someone who would disrupt the system, whether he or she was Democrat, Republican. No one had helped them. They'd lost their chance of the American dream for their children, so they'd go for the disruptor. And so it's economically based. It's holding out often false hope to people on economic hard times. But it's a lesson to governments and to modern political parties that in the end, we have to make sure that as a country's prosperity increases, that increase occurs for all of a country. And too often now we see, whether it's the United States, whether it's Australia, whether it's South or Southeast Asia, people saying the rich are getting richer, the wealthy are getting very wealthy, but the ordinary person is still under financial and economic pressure, is under quality of life pressure, and the divide is getting bigger. That's the ingredient for populism to flourish and governments like Donald Trump to get elected. The second very strong point that Amisha made, which I agree with, is that it suits populists very, very well to, as I put it in an Australian context, to find a monster that's bigger than them. So if you're a populist and your simplistic solutions aren't working, then you find someone who looks to be a bigger problem, a greater monster, someone who, from a political perspective, you can distract the public's attention and have them focus on the larger problem. And so if you're failing on your economic and COVID-19 response, it's very easy to make China the big monster. So there's a political search for, is there someone out there who creates more fear and loathing than I do so that I can avoid scrutiny? Third point, and Ibu Dwi made a really good point. Amisha said the United States remains a relatively young democracy. Well, Australia is sort of half the time of the American democracy, albeit with our Indigenous community, our First Nations people, having the longest continuous civilization in the world, over 45,000 years. But Australia is an island country and an island continent. The United States covers the bulk of North America, sans Canada. Whereas with Indonesia, as Ibu Dwi said, thousands of islands, small, diverse communities, different ethnic and multicultural origins. And the notion of Indonesian identity, the notion of Indonesian nationalism is a good thing. Whereas in the context of Australia, Europe and North America, nationalism can mean economic nationalism, where we say we don't want to trade with other countries. We'll run a local products first and only, irrespective of international competitiveness. So in the Australian context, economic nationalism can bring with it the notions of being inward-looking, of being protectionist, of not wanting to compete on a global scale, not want to engage in trade with other countries and other parts of the region and the world. But again, I strongly agree with Ibu Dwi's point about there's a difference between economic nationalism in that bad sense and then countries saying, well, one of the things that we've learned as a consequence of COVID-19 is that we engaged in globalization, we engaged in bilateral and multilateral trade. But one of the things that we've discovered as a result of COVID is that we've got supply chains which have been disrupted and we've got no local or national capability to quickly respond to that. And so in the Australian context, one of the things that was thrown up very quickly was that we'd lost our capacity to produce protective equipment at surgical or hospital level. And so we had to scramble around the world, not just to China, but elsewhere, to try and find the protective equipment that we needed for our frontline health workers. Well, now there's a focus in Australia and elsewhere on, well, what are those areas where you have to ensure, not from a nationalist economic insular looking point of view, but where are the supply chains where we need to make sure we've got diversity of supply chain from different providers, but where we also need to have a national capacity, whether that national capacity is up front or whether that's a national capacity which you're able to rely upon if your supply chains are disrupted. Now, that's not economic nationalism. That's sensible looking at how to protect the interests, both economic and social and also health of your citizenry. So there's a difference, in my view, a very strong difference between crass economic nationalism, which is about protectionism, and making sure that there's a diversity of supply chain and national capability. And there are some areas of productive activity in the modern era where you absolutely want to have a sovereign domestic capability to protect your interests. And so, for example, having a domestic capability on cybersecurity is in the modern era absolutely essential. So yes, you can rely upon different partners to provide aspects of that through different nations, companies, or multinational companies. But that's one area where, both in terms of protection of secure data, you need to have a domestic capability, and obviously the provision of healthcare, the provision of pharmaceuticals is another area that we've learned from COVID. So there's a nuance there, which Ibu Dwi, I think, has put the spotlight on very well.
Thank you very much. I still have one question to ask, but we are already receiving a lot of questions from the public. So I will start asking questions from the public. So the first question is that it's a symptom, it's a backlash, using Professor Anwar's term, against our failing political and economic system. Don't you think? Since it's a byproduct, it's not inherently bad. I think Professor Anwar can answer it very quickly. 1 minute, yeah.
Yeah, so it is a backlash, so that means that it's a lesson, leaders should have paid attention to this. So as Professor Smith already said, this is what political leaders and also civil society leaders also need to learn, that we have this jargon, no one should be left behind. So when you carry out, whether it's regional integration or so global multilateral engagements, there are people who have the ability to benefit from that. But as we see that now, particularly in these areas of digital age, access becomes very important. Access to education, access to information, access to technology, access to market. And those who are able to get that access will win, and those who do not have access will lose out, and they will, of course, become disgruntled. So this is where policy intervention becomes very, very important. So that, this is not you cannot simply leave it to the market to say, the trickle down effects can be done simply through market forces. So here you can have ideological interventions about the role of the state, but I'm a strong believer that this is policy interventions, government policies, not just at the national level, but also at the regional and global levels. So paying attention to the SDGs, not just make that into performer, but really, really pay attention to all of us SDGs, that we do not leave the vulnerable of the area.
Yeah, thank you. SDG refers to Sustainable Development Goals, but there's one question for you, Amisha. Is populism and nationalism will be a threat to the world? Because I'm worrying that those ideas are the same one which makes World War II. What do you think of that, Amisha? It's a question directly for you.
Sorry, I was on mute. I was saying, I think it's a great question. And I also would argue, yes, populism will remain a great threat to the world. We've seen it, obviously, Bolsonaro. We've seen it with the Saudi MBS. We've seen it with Lukashenko. We've seen it across Russia. Populism has a habit of also cropping up in dictatorships. But when populism takes hold of democracy, that tells us something. Because democratic governments are built off of people having the freedom to choose, people having the freedom to speak, people having the freedom to protest, people having the freedom to have free and fair elections. And when populism takes hold in a place like that, where there are supposed to be these voices of access and equality and equity, and we can go into another discussion about what that actually looks like, especially in America, which democracy is kind of faulty. But I feel as though when we talk about it, we also have to look at, from a global perspective, what is happening. Populism is taking hold in many places, and it's taking hold at a rapid speed, and it's also part and parcel of the authoritarian slide. And I think that what we've seen is not just cult of personality here in America, but a populism stronghold, because as Professor Smith mentioned earlier, we are watching economic declines across various nations. And when you see it across some of the nations that are considered to be the wealthiest on the globe, you're starting to see more and more people have a frustration, particularly working class people, then they need to find some type of outlet of someone to be upset with. And populism allows, from the populist leader standpoint, them to choose an enemy, them to choose a target. And once they do that, and these individuals who already feel like, what they thought about their lives is now turned on its head, they will find that one thing and they will latch onto it, even though it does not help them in the long run, even though it doesn't get their jobs back, it doesn't bring factories back, it doesn't help them to feed their families anymore. But it's this one piece from a charismatic leader that can drive them over the cliff. And I think that it's something that we should all be very mindful of. And I heard what Dr. Davi said earlier. As far as I've studied and as far as I've seen populism, it has not been something that has many positive traits at all. It has always been something that has an undercurrent of something that can be very scary. It's one thing to love your country. I think that all of us love our nations of origin. It's another thing to become so nativist, so populist, that you do not care about or don't see or are not willing to bridge gaps with other nations, or that you do not see that their existence and their progress is part and parcel to your own. And I think that what we have developed is a culture of individualism that is, quite frankly, frightening, because it doesn't allow us to build those multinational relationships that we're going to need to get through some of the hardest times that are ahead.
Thank you. Everybody can weigh in this question, but I would like to ask first Professor Smith, if opportunistic behavior is bad and exploiting the emotions of people is bad, then who is the good guy in politics? Professor Smith first.
Well, the good guy and the good gal in politics are those politicians who seek to advance the interests of their country and their people, both economic and security, but do it from a basis of what's the available evidence, what do we know, what have we learned, and what do we think is a policy prescription which will actually help, rather than ignoring evidence as to the cause of a particular problem. I thought that Ibajui had a good point, which is, sometimes we can learn from populism. So if you look at President-elect Biden's election, he is elected with the largest single vote that we've seen for any presidential candidate. Trump, surprisingly, gets a bigger vote on this than he did in 2016, and gets the largest vote we've seen a Republican Democrat candidate. And after 4 years of experiencing Trump, we scratch our heads and say, well, how did he manage that? And I think he managed that because the basic ingredients for his attractiveness to a lot of the American public remain the same as it did in 2016. In other words, people there saying, well, my economic opportunity is gone, it's lost. He may have done a whole range of different and strange things, but I'm sticking with him because no one else is talking to me in terms which address that particular problem. And I think the single biggest domestic issue that President-elect Biden has, in addition to dealing with the minority and racial problems that he must address, is what's my policy prescription to those people who continue to see that their pathway to economic advancement is lost? What's my policy prescription for people who live in the outer suburbs, but more particularly in rural and regional United States? And if you look at the electoral map, you can see the blue corridor down the western seaboard, the blue corridor on the northeast, and in the middle, it's all red. And when you examine the county votes, Biden gets a good vote in city population centres and suburban population centres, but Trump gets a massive vote in those outlying areas, which is all, in my view, related to economic decline, economic downturn, but most importantly, no economic hope. And so one of the things which, as you put it, the good political guy or the good political gal has to do is be very serious about, I've learned that there's a political opportunity there for a populist. My responsibility as a politician or a political practitioner who wants to advance his people's interests is, what's my policy proposal to alleviate that problem and to advance people's interests? And unless you can do that in a sensible way, you'll continue to lose out to the simple populist notion. And as Amisha said earlier, this is something we've always experienced and we will continue to experience. And it's in a sense our job, and people, like-minded people, to do everything we can to minimise its influence and to minimise the number of countries where it takes hold.
Yeah, it's great to hear that from you, Professor Smith, having worked with the Australian government. But how about you, Professor Anwar? Do you have something to contribute to that question? Who's the good guy, the bad guy? You know?
Yeah, well, we always believe that for most of us who are these talking heads, you know, that it should be the head, but politics is also about the heart. So clearly, it's a combination of getting all the facts right, the evidence-based policies. But successful politicians also are those who are able to reach out the hearts. And unfortunately, this is the problems with our current world. Identity politics matters more quite often than rationalities. And this is, I agree with Misha. You know, this is a threat to peace and stability, where demagogues, you know, were reaching out more to the emotion. And so I suppose for the good, for the good politicians, we need to be able not to be too intellectual about it, I suppose, to be able to articulate complicated messages in a language which are understood and which can also not just touch the heads, but also the hearts of the people. And this is not always very easy. As we see that in many countries, scholars do not make good politicians, you know. So and this is always a challenge, you know, how to get complicated messages out there in a language that is understood, that not only touch the heads but also the hearts of the more ordinary people.
Yeah. How about you, Amisha? Do you have a quick take on that?
Well, I think that I definitely agree with what was just said. One of the biggest issues that we have here in America, at least among Democrats, progressives, is a issue of messaging. There is a crisis mode when it comes to being able to create a message that reaches to what Professor Smith said earlier, those people who live in the rural areas. And I think that that has never been more recognized in the crisis that we saw in the election results of 2020. Again, removing Trump was not the only goal. Democrats also wanted to make sure that they won down ballot races, that they took the Senate, that they took the House. And what we saw was that people whose name wasn't Donald Trump, but who ran on the exact same policies that Donald Trump championed in the White House all won. So this doesn't mean at all that Trumpism has been eradicated. It just means people didn't support Trump in the numbers that they did previously. What we're dealing with is a populism that isn't going to go away anytime soon, and a faction of America that feels like they are consistently left out. And whether or not the Democratic Party is able to speak to those people who live in rural areas has yet to be told. We know that that story and that belief system that the working class was a class that typically landed in the Democratic camp for generations prior, that no longer exists. And I think that at this point, it's part of an understanding that maybe they are looking for something else, and it's not just jobs. There is, at least in this country, an innate racism that exists within this group as well. So when we talk about working class, we also have to remember that working class doesn't only mean working class whites. There are working class Blacks, there are working class Latinos, there are working class Asians, there are working class people of various different demographics and backgrounds. And I think that when the parties are looking towards, developing their messaging, they're only looking towards this siloed group of Caucasian individuals who by and large still feel, because they bought into the narrative that conservatives have used year after year since the 60s. Again, this isn't new. They have always found a group to blame for wage stagnation, for plants and factories leaving this country. And it has always been people of color. So I think that, we're watching a populism that has risen and boiled up over years and over time of discrimination, quite frankly, that a lot of people hold within this country. Even though America is considered a melting pot, I would say that that's absolutely untrue. Yes, we have people from every corner of the universe who live in this country. However, those people are largely siloed into their own groups and very little of their culture is actually represented or even thought of in a positive way. So we're at a point now where we see so much of this that is, basically coming to its head. And the Democratic Party is going to have a hard time over the next few years being able to relate to or try to reach out to these rural communities without also isolating what they see as their base in terms of people of color. Because another thing that we've seen is that those rural notions of populism also have a strong current of racism. And for you to be able to appeal to them, you also have to appeal to that. And that is a very dangerous, a tightrope to have to walk.
Yeah, we have a very, very few time left, but I would like to ask this question to two of you, 1 minute each, because this is the last question from the public. Amidst the mainstreaming of populism by some media, what approach would effectively shift the public understanding that populist and nationalist policies wouldn't sustainably address COVID-19? 1 minute, Professor Anwar first.
Well, that's difficult, but I think it's
populism by some media. What approach would effectively shift the public understanding that populist and nationalist policies wouldn't sustainably address COVID-19?
Yeah, that is not easy, but the most important thing is that it is honesty. I think leaders just need to be honest, that populist strategies are not going to address the pandemic issues. So, when we are faced with this real crisis, stop playing politics. So we have, I think we need to depoliticize COVID-19. I think that is the most important thing, that we need to address it in the most scientific manner, and everybody has to be honest. This is a tour call, but I think that is precisely the primary responsibility, not just of government leaders, but also civil society leaders as well.
Thank you. How about you, Professor Smith? A quick view about that.
Well, Exhibit A, that populist approach to COVID-19 doesn't work, is Donald Trump. And I agree with everything that Ibu Dewey said. And I also reinforce the point you made earlier, which is you can have all of the substantive policy underpinning, but in the end, you've got to be able to communicate that in a way which strikes a chord with individuals. a former Australian Prime Minister had a great phrase, which was that his political opponent was all tip and no iceberg. In other words, had some one-line throwaways and some smart lines, but no substantive underpinning. And often people who are interested in evidence and policy are all iceberg, but can't communicate the tip. And so what's the counter slogan to making America great again? That's the challenge. And all too often, when we're interested in substantive policy, we forget that we then have to communicate that very quickly to a whole range of people who don't want to bother about consuming all of the detail that we do, but what's the one-line throwaway? And that's often the challenging thing to compete with the populists and the nationalists.
Thank you very much. And very quick, Amisha,
No, I would agree with Professor Smith on this. I think that one of the issues that we have is that most people, not only in America, but across the globe, are not policy wonks. We have the greatness of being on this at this forum with a lot of people who have studied and have researched and have written policy papers and informed legislative leaders, and some of whom are legislative leaders themselves. But your average voter in any country is not someone who has that same level of access. They're not going home and reading hundreds of pages of policy. They need to have something condensed. They need to have something that is basically in a tweet style mantra that helps them to understand this at a very granular level. And I don't think that the majority of policy is translated in that way. So that's how we see the rise of populism take off, because they're able to settle on some idealistic, albeit totally mindless piece, but they're able to sell it, and they're able to sell it hard in a way that our policy minds just aren't able to counter. And I think that that's what makes it extremely difficult to try to combat.
Thank you very much. Really, honestly, it's very difficult for me to moderate this session because all our three speakers have very excellent ideas. And now, woo, it's already time. So that's the only time left for us. In fact, I failed to ask the last question. Will we see a rise or decline in populist and nationalist sentiments in global discourses in the years to come? I think we need to ponder that question as we end our session today. But unfortunately, we don't have time to answer that question. But I thank our three wonderful speakers for sharing their time and insights in this discussion. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Stay safe during this time of the pandemic. Congratulations to the three of you. Thank you very much. That ends our session today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful contribution. Professor Anwar, Professor Smith, and Amisha, thank you very much.
Thank you, Romo, for an excellent moderation.